The air hangs thick with olive smoke. A boy, no older than 10, crouches beside a fire pit in the dim courtyard of an Athenian household. His bare knees are blistered from kneeling on stone. A bronze pot bubbles above the flames, meat stew, though he knows he'll never taste it. Behind him a sharp voice barks, "Faster, doulos!" A sandal snaps across his back. He doesn't flinch. He's learned not to. In another corner of the city, a girl no longer a child, but not yet a woman, scrubs linen stained with childbirth and blood. Her hands are raw, her name forgotten even by the mistress she serves. No written record will speak of her. No monument will carry her likeness. She is a shadow that feeds the glory of a civilization that claims to worship freedom. And this is the paradox at the heart of ancient Greece, a world that birthed democracy, philosophy, and theatre, built atop the backs of the unseen. When we imagine ancient Greece, we see marble columns and wise philosophers, golden hoplites and raucous agoras, Socrates in debate, Phidias carving gods. But beneath it all, there was another world, a world of servants, house slaves, wet nurses, stable boys, errand girls, cooks, cleaners, and concubines, the nameless hands that poured the wine at symposia, the voiceless backs that swept the floors of the great temples of Athena and Apollo. It is estimated that in 5th century BCE Athens, as many as 1/3 of the population were enslaved or indentured. They were not all foreigners. Some were born into bondage, others were freeborn Greeks who fell into debt, were abandoned as infants, or captured in wars that churned endlessly across the Mediterranean. Their lives were not gilded. They were the invisible class, stitched into the fabric of every polis, seen yet deliberately unseen. Dawn in Athens breaks with the wail of the rooster, and before the master stirs, his doulos, the household servant, has already risen. He fetches water from the public fountain, queues behind other slaves, dodges the glares of free citizens who mutter that even a slave should know his place. In wealthier homes there were dozens of such servants, one to cook, another to wash feet, one to prepare the bath, another to grind grain. Children had pedagogues, servant tutors, who escorted them to school. Women had wet nurses, often foreign-born Thracians or Phrygians, to suckle their babies. For these servants the home was both prison and livelihood. They lived in windowless quarters, often at the back of the house next to the animals. They were beaten when they made mistakes, silenced when they spoke out of turn, and yet they knew everything: the layout of the home, the politics of the dinner table, the secrets whispered behind curtains. They were the invisible witnesses to the dramas of Greece, and none would ever be invited to speak. How did a society so obsessed with freedom justify so much servitude? Even the greatest minds were complicit. Aristotle argued that some men are by nature slaves, born to serve, lacking the rational soul to govern themselves. He called them living tools, not humans, not citizens, but instruments of productivity. Plato, in his Republic, dreams of an ideal society, and even in this utopia, there are slaves. Though invisible in his ideal city's upper echelons, they are presumed necessary, natural. To challenge the existence of servitude was to challenge the very economy of Greek life. But not all agreed. Alcidamas, a lesser-known sophist of the 4th century BCE, dared to write, "God has set all men free. Nature has made no man a slave." His voice was rare, too rare, and drowned out by the chorus of elite comfort. Many of the servant class were foreigners, captured in war or sold by traders. Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, and Egyptians filled the ranks of Greek households. But others were Greek themselves, orphans, the bankrupt, or victims of political exile. These were the Penastai in Thessaly, the Helots in Sparta, or the doulos in Athens. In Sparta, Helots were technically state-owned, not private property. Yet their condition was no better. They were routinely beaten, forced to wear humiliating clothes, and murdered ritually to keep them fearful and submissive. In Athens, a servant might dream of manumission, legal freedom, but it came at a price, and even then, a freed slave had no citizenship, no real rights, only the illusion of freedom. There is no memoir of a Greek servant, no servant's diary, no funerary stele with epic verses. Their lives were narrated only by those who owned them. We know of them through complaints, "My servant ran away," or jokes, "He's as dumb as a Thracian slave," or casual mentions in plays where a servant appears only to be mocked, ridiculed, beaten for laughs. Aristophanes, in the Knights, uses a slave character named Demos to represent the Athenian people, suggesting that even free citizens could be reduced to servitude in spirit. But even this is satire from above, not empathy from within. So what did they feel? We can guess, but we cannot know. And that's the tragedy. They lived close enough to touch the light of democracy, yet always in its shadow. And yet, some traces remain, in broken pottery with etched names, in skeletal remains buried without honour, in ledgers that recorded purchases, sales and runaways. One haunting line from a fragmentary tombstone reads, "Here lies Myrto, servant of the house, who raised 4 children not her own, and died without one to call her mother." Another line, found on a scrap of papyrus. "I dream of the sea, I have never seen it. They say it's blue like a god's eye." What do we do with these fragments? We mourn them, and we remember them. In ancient Greek, the word doulos means slave or servant, but it also carried another connotation, one bound by duty. That duty for many was not chosen. It was imposed, bought, inherited like a curse. Yet among them were women who gave birth in kitchens, boys who learned Latin from overheard lessons, men who carried secret philosophies they'd never be allowed to speak aloud. They are not side characters. They are the invisible foundation of a world we still praise. And they deserve more than silence, because among these shadows, there was another class even more paradoxical. Not just servants of households, but servants of desire, prostitutes, women who were scorned in public yet sought in private, branded sinners yet worshipped as sacred. The oil lamp flickers in the corner of a dim chamber. Shadows dance across a woman's bare shoulders. Her face is powdered white, her eyes outlined in charcoal. A thin gold circlet rests on her forehead. Not a crown, but not a collar either. Outside, the streets of Corinth pulse with drunken laughter, music, the clatter of sandals over stone. Inside, the room is quiet, controlled. She speaks in soft Ionian, not her mother tongue. She pours wine, offers a smile. Her client is a philosopher, a man who preaches moderation, but in this room he begs for excess. She laughs, not because the joke is funny, but because it must be. Her name is Lycopis. She's a hetera, a companion, not quite free, not quite enslaved, desired but despised, celebrated but never safe. This is the world of ancient Greece's most paradoxical women, prostitutes who lived not at the bottom, but at the edges of the social order, sacred and scorned, powerful and powerless, used and unforgettable. To speak of prostitution in ancient Greece is not to speak of one kind of woman, but of many. There were the pornai, the most numerous, the most exploited, bought, sold, kept in brothels owned by pimps and state officials alike. They worked in the Kerameikos, Athens' red light district, or stood near the harbour, their status marked by tattoos or brands. They were considered dirty, less than women, less than citizens, often less than human. Then there were the heterai, the courtesans, trained in music, philosophy, witty conversation. They entertained at symposia alongside musicians and flute girls. They were expected not only to arouse, but to stimulate minds. They had names, fame. Some had property, influence, even lovers among Athens' elite. But make no mistake, they too were outsiders. Elevated, yes, but always at risk of violence, of jealous wives, of legal invisibility. And finally, there were the temple prostitutes, hierodouloi, as they were called in Corinth and Eryx, women dedicated to Aphrodite. Sacred, yes, but still sold for the pleasure of strangers in the name of the gods. 3 classes, 1 burden, 1 body. The Greeks did not pretend to hide their appetite. Sex was everywhere, in vase paintings, on temple walls, in the poetry of Sappho, the comedies of Aristophanes, the smirking lines of Hesiod and Anacreon. But with desire came hierarchy. Greek society drew harsh lines between wives and whores. Athenian men married women for childbirth and the running of the oikos, the home, but for pleasure, for laughter, for passion, that they sought elsewhere. As Demosthenes famously wrote, "We have courtesans for pleasure, concubines for daily attendance, and wives to bear us legitimate children and be faithful guardians of our households." This wasn't hypocrisy. It was the norm, but it came at a cost. For the women in these other roles were never safe, never fully respected, never allowed to belong. One woman stands out, a name preserved not in stone but in the mouths of men, Aspasia of Miletus. She was no common whore, a hetera who became the lover, companion and rumoured adviser of Pericles, the most powerful man in Athens. She debated Socrates, she hosted philosophers, she may have written speeches, she was admired, envied and attacked. Comic playwrights portrayed her as a corrupting witch. Conservative men accused her of impiety. She was put on trial. For what, we don't know exactly. But we know why, because she stepped beyond the role expected of her. Because she was intelligent, persuasive and female, and because at the end of the day even the most educated courtesan was still to many a body for sale. In brothels the pornae had no agency. They were raped daily under the guise of business. Their earnings went to pimps or state officials. Some were girls as young as 12. In one fragment the playwright Eubaeolus jokes, "If you want virtue, go to a wife. If you want fun, go to a whore. If you want both, buy two." The audience laughed. But behind the laughter was a truth. These women had no legal recourse. If beaten, they could not testify in court. If impregnated, their children had no rights. If they dared to refuse a client, they were punished, sold, or worse. And yet, some found moments of power. Some used beauty, wit, or connections to rise, to claim property, to educate themselves, to build networks in the shadows of the symposium. Powerful, but always temporary, always contingent on pleasing men. Nowhere was the contradiction more intense than in Corinth, at the temple of Aphrodite. Herodotus tells us of over 1,000 sacred prostitutes serving the goddess. Women said to bless sailors, fulfill divine desire, and raise temple funds through their bodies. To serve the goddess was an honour, a ritual, a sacred act. But when the priestesses left the temple, the world saw them no differently than any brothel girl. Men touched them in the street. Women crossed the road to avoid them. Sacred inside, scorned outside. The line between worship and exploitation was thin, and often blurred by wealth and hypocrisy. Very few words survive from the women themselves, but in one rare papyrus, a courtesan writes to her lover, "You see my painted face, but not my soul. You touch my body, but I am miles away. I sell you dreams, but I keep my pain. It is unsigned, undated, but it is real, and it reminds us. Behind every seductive gaze on a Veil painting, behind every lewd joke in a comedy, was a real woman. Breathing, bleeding, enduring. What made prostitutes, even the wealthier hetaerae, so dangerous to Greek society wasn't their sexuality. It was their independence. They could attend symposia, speak freely, engage in politics from the edges. They were often more educated than wives. They made men feel pleasure, yes, but they also made them vulnerable. And vulnerability, in a hyper-masculine culture of control, was terrifying. These women were needed, but never trusted. Loved, but never married. Remembered, but only in whispers. As prostitution became normalized, even taxed, it became an economic engine. Solon, the famed lawgiver of Athens, was said to have founded public brothels to protect women from rape and men from lust. Some praised this as a moral solution. Others saw it for what it was, the commodification of women in the name of order. And here, we begin to see the connection to servitude itself. These women were not considered full persons. They were instruments, as Aristotle once called slaves. Whether bound by chain or coin, their status was the same. Used, discarded, and forgotten. We've seen the women who sold their bodies to survive. Some with pride, some with shame. But many others never had even that choice. This is not the battlefield, but it is war, a quieter war, an economic war, a war of contracts and chains, and it built the foundation of Greek prosperity, which brings us to the next chapter. Ancient Greece gave us philosophy, theatre, democracy, but it also gave us a system where human lives were reduced to financial instruments. Slavery was not an aberration. It was a pillar of the Greek world. So was indentured servitude. So were debt contracts. And it wasn't hidden. It was celebrated, normalized, ritualized. As we journey from the candlelit chambers of prostitutes to the sun-bleached fields of slaves, we see the same brutal logic. Control the body, profit from the labor. But this was colder, less personal, more mechanical. Here, humans were not just touched, they were owned. Slaves in Greece came from everywhere. Thrace, Scythia, Lydia, Phoenicia, Nubia, and even Greece itself. Some were captured in war, the spoils of imperial ambition. Others were born into slavery, inheriting their status like a curse. Some were sold by desperate families, hoping to save the rest. Others became debt bondsmen, shackled not by iron but by ink and broken promises. Aristotle divided slaves into two kinds, slaves by nature and slaves by law, but both bled the same. In Athens, the agora, the bustling city centre, sold everything: fish, wine, sandals, books, and people. Slaves were paraded naked, oiled, examined like cattle, teeth checked, backs inspected for scars, signs of disobedience. A child might sell for half a mina, a trained cook, 3 minas, a strong Thracian woman with weaving skills, 5 minas. One surviving contract reads, I, Cleon, sell the slave woman Diona, Thracian by birth, age approximately 22 years, for 6 minas of silver, sound of body and mind, not prone to running. That was her value, that was her threat. Not all servitude wore chains, some wore ink. Paramount contracts bound people to service, often for years, sometimes indefinitely. A free person, desperate for survival, might enter such a contract voluntarily, but in doing so, they lost nearly everything. They could not leave without permission. They could be beaten. They had no political rights. They were free in name, but bound in practice. A widow, for example, might offer her labour and her child's to a wealthy household in exchange for lodging. One papyrus contract states, she shall serve faithfully for 12 years, her son accompanying her. If she flees, she shall pay triple the value of her service, a life leased like a plough, a child collateralized like a debt. Most slaves served in households or workshops, but some were sent to the silver mines of Lorient, and there the brutal economy showed its darkest face. These mines funded the Athenian Empire, paid for the Parthenon, funded the navy that defeated Persia, but the cost? Thousands of lives. Slaves worked in cramped tunnels, often naked, breathing dust that ate away at their lungs. Boys as young as 8 carried stones on their backs. The air was poison. The guards were merciless. They were allowed no names, no marriages, no rest. If one died, another was bought. Even Aristotle admitted in his cold wisdom that some work was too brutal for citizens to bear, so they sent slaves. And history calls that democracy. Slavery was not merely tolerated, it was institutionalized. City-states had official slave registries, taxes on manumission, and laws regulating slave behavior. In Athens, some slaves belonged to the state. The Scythian archers, armed police who kept order. Mine slaves worked to fund public buildings. Court recorders who etched verdicts into stone. They had no freedom, but they were necessary. And when a slave became useful enough, they might be freed, but never equal. Freed slaves had no citizenship, no vote, no protection. Their children would remain in limbo, never truly Greek. As the orator Lysias once declared, a freedman is not free by nature, only by law, and law can change. The Greeks admired contracts, logic, calculation, but these same virtues allowed them to justify slavery as economics, not cruelty. A man could sell his daughter's labour for 5 years. A woman could rent herself to avoid starvation. A creditor could bind an entire family with a single clause. Everything was negotiable, except dignity. We see it in Plato's Laws, where he writes, the proper use of a slave is to serve his master, but he must be treated justly, lest he become useless. Justice then was not for the slave, but for the utility of the master. Many slaves were branded, on the forehead, the arms, the thighs. Some bore the mark of their profession, others their owner's initials. One inscription reads, I belong to Callias. If you find me, return me for 2 aboles. A slave's body was not their own. Even in death, their tombstones were paid for, if at all, by masters. A rare grave marker reads, Here lies Timon, trusted servant. May he rest, though his rest is not his own. Even death was on loan. But not all submitted. Some ran, some resisted. Some found ways to sabotage, steal, subvert the system that chained them. One slave, Soses of Syracuse, famously fled his master and founded a life among pirates. Another, Machaon, a cook, used his culinary skill to earn enough to buy his freedom, and later opened his own tavern. They were rare, but they existed. Cracks in the system, sparks in the dark. Greek authors, like most ancient writers, were not interested in tales of rebellion from the lower classes. They spoke of order, of obedience, of the natural hierarchy. Aristotle claimed that slaves were better off under Greek masters. That rebellion would be foolish, even unnatural. And yet, the records whisper otherwise. Scattered across inscriptions in the margins of court speeches, in the warnings carved into temple walls, we find traces of the unruly, the runaways, the fighters. Their names may be lost, but their impact was real. Running away was the most common form of resistance. It was dangerous. It was rare, but it happened. Athenian law required that runaways be returned or punished. There were even slave catchers, hired mercenaries who roamed the countryside in search of escaped labour. Yet some slaves made it. One fragment from a tomb in Attica reads, "He died free, though he was born in chains." We do not know who he was, but someone years later thought his defiance was worth remembering. In cities like Corinth and Thebes, underground networks likely existed, slaves hiding slaves, sympathizers offering food, freedom-bought former doulos giving shelter in exchange for labour, like flickers of rebellion beneath a world that pretended all was calm. One of the rare court cases involving a slave's insubordination appears in a speech by Isaias. He refers to a household servant named Hermion, born a slave, trained as a scribe. When his master fell into debt, Hermion manipulated the family records, redirecting property titles and claiming legal freedom through forged documents. He was caught, beaten, prosecuted, but his story was preserved because the scandal embarrassed the elite. Hermion had dared to use the master's tools against him: language, literacy, law. The very things Greece claimed made men free. Not all resistance was escape. Some took place in plain sight. Among prostitutes, especially heterae, some women weaponized their position to amass influence in a society that denied them respect. Take Neaira, a courtesan sold into brothel slavery as a child. She later bought her freedom and became the companion of an Athenian citizen, Stephanus. But Neaira was put on trial, accused of pretending to be a citizen's wife. A crime in Athens. She faced exile or death. Her defense? That she was more Greek in spirit than the men accusing her. "I raised his children. I kept his house. I honoured the gods. What is it to be Athenian if not this?" She lost. She vanished from history. But her speech, preserved by Apollodorus, still survives. A defiant, trembling voice, speaking across time. Nowhere was fear of rebellion more deeply embedded than in Sparta. The helots, state-owned slaves of the Spartan regime, outnumbered the citizen class, sometimes 7-1. Every year, during the Crypteia, young Spartan men were ordered to murder helots in secret, as a rite of passage, and a method of psychological warfare. And yet, the helots resisted. They poisoned food, they staged uprisings, they sabotaged harvests, they plotted alliances with enemies during wars. In 464 BCE, a devastating earthquake hit Sparta, and the helots seized the moment, launching a full-scale revolt. It took years and Athenian intervention to suppress them. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a war, a reminder that no chain is ever fully secure. For some, resistance was slow, cunning, financial. A slave in Athens could, if permitted, earn wages on the side. Over time, some bought their freedom, or that of their children. These weren't just economic acts, they were revolutionary. The story of Passion is legendary. A former slave banker, Passion earned his freedom, married a citizen woman, and became one of the wealthiest men in Athens. He even donated to public works, earning partial honorary citizenship. His success was used by Athenians to argue that slavery could be fair, even benevolent. But in truth, Passion's story was the exception. He succeeded not because of the system, but despite it. He was a crack in the dam, proof that ambition could bleed through stone. A civilization that gave us gods, myths, and memory, somehow forgot the people who kept it alive. This is not an accident. This is erasure. History is not a mirror. It is a lens, shaped, focused, directed. What we know of ancient Greece comes from a narrow corridor of voices, elite men, landowners, philosophers, generals, and poets. Their scrolls were copied, their monuments preserved, their names passed down like sacred relics. But the voices of the doulos, the hetaira, the helot, the wet nurse, the mine worker were never meant to be remembered. They were tools, not people, and tools do not write histories. Take a moment to consider who wrote what survives. Thucydides, general and historian. Herodotus, aristocrat and traveller. Plato, student of Socrates, founder of the academy. Xenophon, soldier and landowner. Aristotle, philosopher and tutor to kings. All brilliant minds, all men of privilege, all surrounded by servants, and yet they rarely mention them except as background noise, comic relief, or philosophical examples. What they left behind was not the whole story. It was the story they believed mattered. Walk through the ruins of Athens. You'll see monuments to soldiers, to orators, to gods, statues with glowing inscriptions, to the courage of the citizen, to the glory of Athena, but nothing to the woman who scrubbed the floor of the temple, nothing to the boy who carried water from the spring, nothing to the nurse who raised 3 generations of a family not her own. They are absent from art, absent from inscriptions, absent from law, except when punished or owned. They were essential, but they were not remembered, because memory is political. In Athens, citizenship was the measure of worth. To be remembered in public life, you had to be a male citizen, born of 2 Athenian parents, landholding, free, slaves, women, foreigners, prostitutes. They existed outside the civic story. In Sparta, helots were not even considered human. They were living tools, used but not mourned. If a helot died in service, it was no more noted than the breaking of a cart. And in Greek philosophy, memory itself was elitist. Plato believed only the rational soul was worth recalling. Aristotle claimed some were born to be ruled, and thus need not be remembered. Even epic poetry, the earliest form of memory, focused on kings and heroes, not the hands that fed them. The Greeks didn't just forget the lowly, they built a system that ensured they would not be remembered. And yet, here and there, cracks form in the marble. A few graffiti scratches in the servant quarters of Delos, a name etched by a prostitute onto the wall of a bathhouse. Philia was here, beautiful, desired, forgotten, a fragment of a slave's tombstone in Piraeus. He served well, may he rest. One papyrus letter, unsigned, addressed to no one. They do not see us, but we see everything. We know their voices, their hungers, their cruelty. They cannot remember us, but the gods might. These are not histories, they are hauntings, reminders that lives were lived, even if no one recorded them. In ancient times, scribes chose what to copy. Monks and scholars in the Middle Ages chose which scrolls to preserve. Museums in modern Europe decided what belonged behind glass. And consistently, the same pattern repeated: keep the great, exclude the nameless, forget the undesirable. Even today, archaeology prioritizes palaces over kitchens, temples over workshops, battlefields over brothels. But the truth lies in the ashes, not the altars. Was it forgetfulness, or was it fear? Perhaps the Greek world could not face the truth that its greatness was built on subjugation, that its democracy existed because others could not vote, that its art thrived because others cleaned the floors, that its minds soared because others carried the weight. So instead of facing that contradiction, history did what it always does. It buried them. Even today, many textbooks describe Greece as the cradle of Western civilization, the birthplace of freedom. We read about Pericles, not the nameless servant who bathed his sons. We quote Socrates, not the slave boy he humiliated in philosophical games. We praise the architecture, but forget the slaves who quarried the stone, often dying beneath falling columns. Our collective memory has been filtered, scrubbed clean of the bodies it was built upon. And that silence echoes louder than any speech. Despite the silence, some truths endure. In the worn floor tiles of Greek homes, smoothed by bare feet. In the calluses on unearthed skeletons. In the shards of pottery, painted not with gods but with women pouring wine. They left no epics, but they left evidence. And now, we, the listeners, the seekers, must become the voices they were denied. They were erased, but they are not gone. We revere the Greeks as pioneers of thought, reason, democracy, beauty, and they were, but they also pioneered a dangerous tradition, forgetting the people beneath greatness. When we walk through the ruins of their world, we admire the architecture, but ignore the backs that broke building it. We quote their philosophers, but forget they owned human lives. We praise their art, but forget the bodies that were sold to fund it. And unknowingly, we have become their heirs, not just in reason, but in amnesia. Today, slavery is illegal in most of the world, but economic servitude, the kind where a person is trapped in cycles of debt, labor, and silence, is very much alive. The domestic workers in global cities, paid pennies and stripped of rights. The garment workers, sewing luxury labels they'll never wear. The undocumented field hands who feed nations yet sleep in fear. The sex workers, hidden behind closed doors or criminal records, trafficked and forgotten. Just like in ancient Greece, they are essential. Just like in ancient Greece, they are unseen. And just like then, their voices rarely make it into the history books, or the headlines, or our conversations. Women's labour, both paid and unpaid, has always been the unseen infrastructure of society. In ancient Greece, women were expected to be silent, obedient, invisible, whether free or enslaved. Today, though legally free, millions of women still operate within systems that echo those ancient roles. Caregiving without recognition, sexual labor without protection, household work without security, voices without platforms, even our language reflects it. Behind every great man, they say. Always behind, always shadowed. And when their stories do surface, they're framed as exceptions, not foundations. Consider what museums preserve. Consider what documentaries celebrate. Consider what we teach in school. Do we tell the story of the empire builders or the cooks in their kitchens? Do we remember generals or the boys who carried their shields? In Greece, the elite wrote their own immortality. In modernity, we choose whose names go viral, whose stories trend, whose pain is believed. Erasure is no longer done by chisel and scroll. It's done by click and silence. To forget is not neutral. Every time we erase the story of a servant, a prostitute, a laborer, we reinforce the lie that greatness is self-made. We forget that democracy was built on the backs of the voiceless. We forget that beauty was born from suffering. We forget that survival is sometimes the greatest act of resistance. History is not just about what happened, it's about who mattered enough to remember, and the Greeks, for all their genius, taught us to discard the inconvenient. Their ghost lingers in our cities, in the worker who fears deportation more than disease, in the mother who sells herself to feed her child, in the janitor who cleans a university hall he could never afford to enter. In the woman forced to choose between dignity and survival. They were there in ancient Athens, and they are here now. They never left. We just changed the words. Metic, doulos, hetera became undocumented, essential, criminal, but the roles, they're ancient. What if we remembered not just the warriors, but the weavers, not just Socrates, but the slaves he questioned, not just Pericles, but the people who cooked his meals? What if we saw dignity in the lowliest tasks? What if we made monuments to care, not just conquest? What if the next history we write includes everyone? Because only then can we claim to have evolved beyond the ruins. Don't get me wrong, the Greeks gave us so much, but they also gave us a blind spot, a curated memory, cut and polished like marble, gleaming and hollow. In the end, it wasn't just the Parthenon that survived, it was the pattern of who gets seen and who stays in shadow. We live in that shadow still, but we can choose to turn around, to light a torch, not for heroes, but for the hands that lifted them, to speak the names never written, to honour the lives never honoured, because the forgotten, they are still here, watching, waiting, whispering. So now I ask you, what does it say about a civilization that needed these women but refused to honour them? What is the price of a civilization's greatness when its foundation is human suffering? Because history doesn't speak for the oppressed unless we make it. Let us know what you think. Do you believe they had power, or were they always prisoners? Comment your thoughts, debate their legacy, and if their stories moved you, subscribe to Legacy of Greece. Because the past isn't buried, it's waiting to be heard.